So hopefully you've watched the previous videos on evolution, and now we're going to talk about Hardy Weinberg equilibrium or Hardy Weinberg equation. And this is one of the topics that requires some math involved. So for those of you who hate math, don't worry. This math is actually really simple. If it's not, pause the video and go back and look at it again. This is actually very, very simple. And if you are taking an AP biology course, you bet that this is going to be a gradient question. And remember, the gradient questions are all mathematical based, and they can be either just chi-square analysis, genetic understanding of genetic pedigrees, Hardy Weinberg, understanding the Hardy Weinberg equation. So please, this is very, very important. So Hardy Weinberg equation, there's two equations that you have to memorize. And the equations are p squared plus 2pq plus q squared is equal to 1, and p plus q is equal to 1. Now, before we even talk about what this means and how do we use this equation, let's go ahead and talk about Hardy Weinberg, in general, what Hardy Weinberg equilibrium means. So Hardy Weinberg was a scientist, and he discovered an equation that basically stated whether or not a certain population has undergone evolution. What is evolution? Evolution doesn't mean when humans have wings and start to fly off. Evolution simply means time. Evolution simply means change. Okay, a significant change. So obviously, as a species, as a population, as a species, if we're evolving, that means we're all changing towards a certain direction. And Hardy Weinberg basically proposed certain ideas, and he said that, for a population to not undergo evolution, so if we stay at Hardy Weinberg equilibrium, we have to undergo certain things, or there have to be certain parameters that must be maintained. And if we want to not undergo Hardy Weinberg equilibrium and we want to promote evolution, then we have to follow some certain parameters, okay? So this equation, as you'll see at the end of the video, basically shows us whether or not a population over time has undergone evolution. So first, let's talk about how do we stay in Hardy Weinberg equilibrium? How do we never go and experience evolution as a population? The first thing you have to understand is that evolution is not individual. Okay, I cannot evolve. Okay, a population, a large population can evolve. Species evolve. Okay, so the first thing to understand, to be maintained at Hardy Weinberg equilibrium, is that we cannot undergo any mutations. There must be no mutations. No mutations in the genetic code. Now, obviously, right off the bat, you're like, hey, man. Obviously, there's mutations. Obviously, the sun is over there. We have ultraviolet radiation exposure. Obviously, there's genetic mutations that can occur. I'm just letting you know that in the Hardy Weinberg equilibrium system, if we don't want to promote evolution, we should understand these certain parameters. And the first parameter I usually like to talk about is there must be no mutations involved. So we live in a society, let's just pretend, we live in the Hardy Weinberg equilibrium society, and there are no mutations. Great, that's pretty cool. By the way, mutations does not mean that you suddenly look ugly or deformed. Mutations simply mean a change. Okay, so if you have a change from the original diagram, that means you've experienced a mutation, a change. The next thing you have to understand is that we need to have a large population. Let me ask you something. What's more likely to undergo evolution or change, a large population or a small population? Think about it this way. If we introduce a disease, a deadly disease, into a small population that is in an island separated from the rest of the world, then this single disease that affects one individual or two individuals is much more disastrous, right? Because we only have a small population to begin with, and it's going to cause rapid change. In a large population, not to sound mean, but you know what? People die all the time. People die from diseases. People die from certain mutations. Doesn't matter, because you know what? The large population, but majority of us are still just, we're not undergoing significant change. So that's very interesting. So we already have a large population, therefore it takes us a long time to undergo evolution. But understand, to maintain an equilibrium, we have to have a very large population, ideally, and no mutations. These are things you must memorize or have in the back of your head. On the AP biology test, you'll be given a question in which one of these factors lets you know that you stay in Hardy Weinberg equilibrium. And they might say no mutations. Well, that's the answer. Okay, so let's just fill in this part over here. Obviously, if you want to promote evolution, you want mutations. Okay, quote unquote, you want a small population size, population sample. What else? Oops. Non-random. Okay, let's talk about this. Random mating versus non-random mating. I think as a community, especially in our previous generation, our parents' generation, people like to mate within their community, okay? So if you were born in a small town in China called Town X, you would probably find a wife from Town X, and you would have kids with your wife from Town X. You are choosing who you're going to marry and mate with. You are essentially choosing your wife, and your wife who will give birth to your kids eventually. This is actually promoting evolution, and I'll tell you why. It's because if you're going to go ahead and marry within your community, this person has similar genes, okay, to you as well. So you're not promoting variation. You're not allowing variation to occur. You're not allowing equal amounts of DNA to be exchanged to produce a very, very, I would say, an exotic offspring. In this case, with random mating, where you basically go ahead and close your eyes, and so if I was a guy and I want to undergo the Hardy Weinberg equilibrium to make sure as a society we're not promoting evolution, I would go ahead and line up 20 girls in a circle, and they would be all different ethnicities, and I would close my eyes and I would go ahead and stop, and I would say, "Hey, what's your name?" "Hi, Sally, nice to meet you. You're my wife now, and let's have kids." Okay, this is called random mating, and essentially what we're doing is we're giving an equal chance of our DNA, of our genetic information to be passed on. Okay, we're not going ahead and picking and choosing. Okay, that's limiting diversity. If I go ahead and do that and pick a random person, I'm now everyone is diversifying themselves, and they're giving an equal opportunity to everyone to exchange their genetic material to produce their offsprings. And in reality, actually, in a sense, random mating usually does generate healthier babies. When you marry within your community sometimes, or closer to your familial line, then you start to have problems. And that we already talked about that in the genetic videos. So that's sort of interesting. If you want to go ahead and line up, 20 girls or 20 guys, feel free to do that. Just, I'm not promoting it. Okay, so no mutations, a large population, random mating, no genetic drift. Genetic drift. You don't want anybody's genes going ahead, and you don't want it lost in a certain community. Let's just say we are now in an island. Okay, you don't want to go ahead and now introduce new genes, or you don't want to go ahead and take your genes and introduce it to a new community, because that promotes evolution. Okay, so these are certain parameters that let you stay in equilibrium. These are certain parameters that are promoting evolution. So if you have mutations, small population, non-random mating, genetic drift, if you have the bottleneck effect, these are all things that are promoting evolution. So that's just a brief summary of the parameters you have to really realize for the exam. And now we can finally go ahead and talk about this equation. P squared plus 2pq plus q squared is equal to 1, and p plus q is equal to 1. You need to understand what defines what. So the p represents the dominant allele, the q represents the recessive allele. Write this down. This represents the dominant allele. This represents a recessive allele. And this represents, I'm not going to write this down because, well, I'll make a shortcut. This is homozygous dominant. This represents homozygous dominant. This represents homozygous recessive. And this represents heterozygous. Okay, so now we're coming back into Mendelian genetics again. Okay, remember, don't forget about Mendelian genetics terminologies, dominant allele, recessive alleles, homozygous dominant. What does homozygous dominant mean? It means big B and big B. Small b means homozygous recessive. Heterozygous means hybrid. We have one big B, one small b. These are the genotypes, right? Phenotypes are what you see. Okay, so the first thing, if we want to understand what's going on here, is to understand this represents homozygous dominance, this represents homozygous recessive, this represents a population with heterozygous genotypes, and this just represents a dominant allele and a recessive allele. Let's look at a question first, okay? You're going to be confused for a little bit, but by the end of the video, everything will be cleared up. So, let's say, here's a question. I'm just going to make it up. There are 9% of blue-eyed people, in the world. Let me make this nicer. There are 9% of blue-eyed people I'm giving you very limited information, okay? Find percent of homozygous dominant brown eyes, question mark, and find percent of homozygous dominant brown eyes plus heterozygous brown eyes. So there's going to be two answers to the question. The first one asks find the percentage in the population that have homozygous dominant brown eyes, meaning big B, and find the percentage of homozygous dominant brown eyes plus heterozygous brown eyes. How do we do this? This is very, very weird because I only give you one piece of information. Actually, this is all we need to answer this question. So the first thing you need to understand is that blue eyes is a recessive, homozygous recessive genotype, meaning that in order to have that, you need to have small b. You also need to understand that the question over here is asking you for big B. The question over here is asking you for big B plus big B, small b. Heterozygous and homozygous dominant. Okay. Pay very careful attention, okay? I want you to do this problem exactly the way I did it. Whenever you see a Hardy Weinberg problem on the exam, automatically the first thing you want to look for is q squared. You want to say, what is q squared? What is the value of q squared? What is q squared? We already know that q squared means the percent in homozygous recessiveness. There are 9% of blue-eyed people in the world. We know that 9%, we know that blue-eyed people are homozygous recessive. I'm telling you 9% of the population, 9% of the population remain blue-eyed, 9% of the population have blue eyes, and that is q squared. So q squared is equal to 9%. Ladies and gentlemen, just like in math, we don't want to use percent. So don't write 9%, because we're going to have to do some simple math here. Convert 9% into decimal. Hopefully you know that that's 0.09. Okay, not 0.9, that's 90%, 0.09. Okay, so 0.09. So q squared is equal to 0.09. Very important. First thing you want to do in any problem they give you is find out what is q squared equal to. I'm going to give you several examples of how the questions can be rearranged, but this is by far the easiest, the question I can give you. Q squared is equal to 0.09. What do you do next? Don't do anything. Only square root this, okay? Don't start to say, okay, so let me go ahead and play around with this and rearrange this, you know, let me do some basic algebra. No, don't do that. As soon as you find q squared, you can go ahead and take the radical of both of these and find the value of q. And you'll see why, okay? Okay, so radical q squared is equal to q. Remember the radical and the squared cancel out. And then what is radical 0.09? It's 0.3. You're not allowed a calculator on the AP Bio exam, okay? Don't say you can't do this. Very simple math, okay? Q is equal to 0.3. Radical 0.09 is 0.3. Q is equal to 0.3. Q is equal to what? 0.3. Look at this. Hold on. So I know P plus Q equals 1 because that's an equation that I have to memorize. Okay, so P plus, hold on, Q, I'm not gonna write down Q because I just know what Q is for this problem. Q is 0.3 is equal to 1. Hello, I can solve for P, right? Minus 0.3 minus 0.3. P is equal to 0.7. P is equal to 0.7. P is equal to 0.7, Q is equal to 0.3. 0.7 plus 0.3 is equal to 1. You can never get a value of Q or P that is 1 or higher, okay? Then these two values together will add up to 1. So it's very simple. You're gonna always on the question on the exam have the answer being either 0.1, 0.2, 0.3, 4, 5, 6, all the way to 0.8 or 0.9, okay? So Q is 0.3, P is 0.7, and this is a critical piece of information I need. As long as you get these two values, the recessive allele and the dominant allele numbers, you can answer any single question they give you on the exam for this problem, okay? So now, this is all you need. So don't start going ahead and plugging things here and there and getting all confused. As soon as you figure this out, now you read question 1, part A. Find the percent of homozygous dominant brown eyes. Homozygous dominant. P squared is homozygous dominant. P squared is homozygous dominant. That means, forget about everything here. I just want to solve what is P squared. Do I know the value of P? Yes, I do. P is 0.7. So, for A, I have 0.7 squared. What's 0.7 squared? That's 0.49. Okay, convert it into percentage, that's 49%. This is how easy this problem is, okay? Hardy Weinberg Equilibrium Equation is very, very easy, okay? So, 0.7 squared is 49%. Your answer is 49%. 49% of the population have homozygous dominant brown eyes. Okay, let's take a look at this. Find the percent of homozygous dominant brown eyes. We just did that. Okay, so that's 49%. Plus, remember, you have to plus heterozygous brown eyes. Take a second. Where do we find out the value of heterozygous? Heterozygous is represented by 2pq. Heterozygous is represented by 2pq. 2 times p times q. What is the value of p? 0.7. So 2 times 0.7 plus 2 times 0.7 times q, which is 0.3. What's 0.7 times 0.3? 0.21. What's 0.21 times 2? 0.42. Convert this into percentage. 42% is heterozygous brown eyes. But don't forget, 49% plus 42%. So 49% plus 42% is 91%. So the answer to your question for part B is 91% of the population have homozygous dominant brown eyes and heterozygous brown eyes. Another easy way you could have said is, hey, well, if this is a homozygous recessive, 9%, then obviously everything else in the equation has to be 100% minus 9%, which is 91%. But this is exactly how you should be doing it, okay? Don't look at the question and try to just, logically think your way through this. You must use the equation. This is the easiest type of problem they can possibly give you, okay? We're gonna do more problems that are a little bit more, they're not complex, but you have to take an extra step to go ahead and find the value of q squared. Really quick recap. You must memorize this. P squared is homozygous dominant, 2pq is heterozygous, q squared is homozygous recessive. P is a dominant allele, q is the recessive allele. Question asks you, there are 9% of people in the population with blue eyes. You should already know that blue eyes is homozygous recessive. That means q squared is 9%. Convert it to decimal, 0.09. What do you do immediately after that? Take the square root. Q is equal to 0.3. If we know what q is equal to, we automatically know what p is equal to. You just do 1 minus whatever you have here. So 1 minus 0.3 is 0.7. As soon as you do this, make a big box. Okay, these are going to give you the answers to all your questions. Read part A, find percent of homozygous dominant brown eyes. You know that homozygous dominant brown eyes is p squared. What's the value of p? 0.7. 0.7 squared is 49%. That's it. If I ask you for heterozygous brown eyes, what's the percent of only heterozygous brown eyes in the population? 2 times 0.7 times 0.3, which is 42%. Okay, so take a minute to look over this entire video and hopefully you understand the Hardy Weinberg equilibrium equation.